I want to first thank you, Sevi, for the invitation to come and share with the community here today at the 15th Annual Rafiki Health Summit. On the 40th anniversary, it's an honor to come and contribute and share just a drop in the bucket within such a long legacy of healing arts for the Black community in San Francisco. And I hope I do it justice. I'm honored to be here in the presence of community members, distinguished body of practitioners, and to commune at a time such as this. I pay homage to the elders here, those who have held up the foundation of this organization, those who are with us in spirit, all the practitioners of healing arts, from Western traditions to indigenous origins. I pay homage to each of your ancestors who continue to plant seeds of inspiration and inheritance that guide your journey of wholeness. To hold a vocation in the healing arts at this critical moment in history is no small feat. Your devotion, your discipline, your effort and courage, tenacity and endurance, all rooted in compassion and a charge to alleviate the suffering of others, is worthy of acknowledgement. So just want to take a moment to acknowledge that. So before diving deeper into what I've prepared for the time today, I want to take a moment to speak to how I arrived at this topic, this focus on psychological wholeness within the Black American experience. With a legacy of 40 years offering mental health practices, sessions, grief circles, circles for mothers, food sustainability, food access, addressing displacement, a legacy of 40 years of doing that as a non-traditional or dominant organization is incredible. And what I have prepared for you today, my hope is that it can offer some deeper context as to why it's so incredible. Because those contemporary institutions, mainly the mental health field that I've been trained in, that Sevi is training in, has its limitations. I know I'm speaking to the choir. But I want to offer the critical context and some language, because to name something breaks the yoke, as my mama once said. Ibaye. So this all started with a chat with Sevi many, many moons ago. And we were talking about our elders who lived through things like desegregation in the United States. And we were talking about finding it remarkable that we are just now finding the time, the space, and the language to actually grapple with the terrorism that those children endured crossing those lines, going into and desegregating schools. We call it racial trauma, racial fatigue. We have all kinds of language for it now, but it's relatively new. And many contemporary practitioners don't even touch it with a 10-foot pole. So that's where I've centered my work. That's where I deepen my roots. We are recently carving out the space and time and exalting the proper supports to feel this experience of our people, our Black kin folk, our elders, and feeling as the gateway to healing. I'm going to be focusing in my time on grappling with the limitations of contemporary approaches to mental well-being, mainly Western psychology and psychiatry. And then move into the frontiers with some reflections on indigenous psychologies, collectivism, and ancestral healing. Also, I'm holding close to honoring the tools of care that were forged in the underground. And you will hear a little bit about that in my time, in the subaltern, in the margins. We've always figured out ways to care for ourselves. Just as we did 5, 10, 15 minutes ago. We've moved our bodies. We've sang the hymns in fields. We've created rituals of dignity and self-care and honor in the face of devastation. And that's profound. So the ways that our consciousness widened to meet the moment over the past 400 years. And there's an urge that I hold to tap deeper into that expanded consciousness among the Black experience, to see that as the root of our well-being, the fact that we were able to do that. It's a part of our inheritance. So this offering is rooted in that recognition of the ways we are still finding and sharing language that describes our experience in a heartfelt depth, from rupture toward resonance and wholeness. This offering is one gesture toward that. So let me begin. In the spirit of relationality, allow me to reintroduce myself. My name is Amber. I am a decolonial depth psychologist with specialization in somatic depth psychology and community liberation, indigenous, and ecological depth psychologies. I have ancestral roots in Louisiana. Where you at? Where y'all at? If you know, you know. Extending back to the 1700s, my people have been there for a long time. And they came by way of Haiti, parts of West and Central Africa, as well as France, because we're Creole. When they got to Louisiana, they mixed with the Chitimacha indigenous Americans in the South. I relocated to the Bay Area in 2006 on a glory wave called Hurricane Katrina. Sidebar, we will unpack the renaming of that process later, okay? My vocation, my work centers on cultural healing, and more specifically, the impact of culture on psychic and psychological well-being. It centers decolonial lens, stated differently, taking seriously in interpretation and healing all those healing modalities that impacted all those approaches and practices that reshaped identities over the past 400 years, like, for example, the making of races. Race is not a natural phenomenon. It was imagined and then orchestrated. And the stronghold of a global market called extractive capitalism, and how that affects our psychological well-being. So it's moving from the overemphasis on the individual to looking at the larger macro circle of the collective. You can never take a symptom outside of the context of its emergence. So if I'm depressed, maybe it's because poverty is a cultural trauma. It's invented. It doesn't have to be this way. Hurricane Katrina in 2005 was my initiation onto this path, a lifelong journey to discover how a tear in the cultural fabric impacts the body, impacts biology, impacts the mind and the psyche. I mention these things to forge a clear intersection between us, myself as a decolonial depth psychologist, and I center the philosophical, the metaphysical in my approach to wholeness making, and all agents who pour energy into Rafiki. At this intersection lives culture, the waters we're all swimming in, our socio-political climate, our relationship to nature, which determines how we treat the environment, the historical inheritances we carry and co-navigate, the memories we replicate, patterning new future experiences. So culture, as I hold it, is the external expression of internal values. It is the shared beliefs, customs, behaviors, ethos, and symbols of a group of people, any group of people. So in the spirit of animism, to make other things animated, the idea that humans are not the only beings present, consider that culture itself can be wounded. Culture can have a wound. Cultural trauma is understood to be a dysregulation of the collective's nervous system, just as personal trauma is understood to be a dysregulation of an individual nervous system. often as a result of radical ruptures such as war, economic violence, or inequality, inhumane political choices, houselessness, the commodification of basic human needs, which is really a rejection of the sacred law of sharing. Abuses of power by institutions, these are just to name a few. From my vocational perspective, my commitment is that these are the root cause of mental instabilities. To make it granular, external conditions affect biology. We understand this through things like epigenetic research, where they've looked at how the experiences of a mother can be passed on to the fetus in utero and affect the entire growth of the individual, right? Fundamentally, this epigenetic transmission is a biophilic function. It's a gesture at trying to preserve life, trying to warn the child in the womb. These are the conditions outside, right? To prepare them. But when those external conditions are unrelenting, capacity for the body to adapt is exceeded, and this can lead to dis-ease and unwellness. So I know this is vast terrain to traverse in our short amount of time, so let me state my heartfelt intention clearly. We recognize that there are limitations in the contemporary fields of psychology and psychiatry. How many of y'all heard about the APA's apology for racism? The American Psychological Association apologized for racism in 2021. You have a few head nods? Okay, so we're gonna unpack that and highlight, exalt the importance of institutions like this. Okay. Most aspects of our training, as I've talked about with Sevi, do not adequately meet the needs of our communities, and in some cases even serve to perpetuate harms. My aim is to fill in a few of those gaps by naming the status quo and pointing to the generative new directions we're walking. I'll start by setting the context we're in. Let's unpack our current socio-political climate, and then illuminate a few ways this impacts healing arts. Then we'll look to the colonial roots of psychiatry and psychology. And finally, from there, we're going to journey into liberatory frontiers through the works of Frantz Fanon, the first decolonial psychiatrist, Martin Barrow, liberation psychologist, Malidoma Patrice Somé, Dagara, West African shaman and healing practitioner. My hope is that we can churn the soil for reclaiming, remembering, returning to, reawakening what supports our wholeness. So I know y'all are aware, but our current socio-political climate is characterized by a rise in national and global fascism, authoritarianism. We're witnessing increased polarization along racial, ethnic, gender, and class lines. There's a blatant coup of the executive branch of our government, a widening of the river of xenophobia against immigrant communities, along with weaponization of ICE into a paramilitary force, a strengthening of neo-colonial projects worldwide, like we're doing it again, with geopolitical chaos ensuing in the Congo, Sudan, Palestine, and beyond. There's a stirring of historical and ancestral trauma related to sexual harms, with all the files that keeps getting talked about in the news, among other things. The spectrum of discord is vast, and it affects every aspect of our lives, from housing to healthcare, from environmental justice to education. I could go on, but no, you get the feeling tone. And in our individual ways, we're each on the front lines of this cultural rupture in one way or another. And this is evidenced in our bodies and psyches. We're shouldering the weight of these tsunamis, living with and through the unpredictable changes that visit us daily. I state these here for a few very specific reasons. Number one, getting grounded about the context within which we live and work is fundamental to holistic well-being. It's important to be clear about the psychic ecosystem that we're wading through. so that we can embody an ethic of relationality as fundamental to any decolonial pursuit. And by decolonial, let me unpack that word. As my mentor advised, it simply means wholeness making. So whatever has been severed or fractured, to be decolonial is to repair that split. If I have been kicked out of the human family because of racialization, then decolonial is to put me back at the center of the human family. Number two, beyond the material implications of these things, this context generates a kind of psychic blueprint that constellates in our being, our body, our mind, our soul. Culture impacts the psyche. Cultural toxins have detrimental effects on psychological well-being and can produce physical, somatic symptoms. There's a deep need for incorporating these variables that live in unseen realms. And third, cultivating critical awareness about what we're shouldering serves to lighten the load a bit. I recall a moment shortly after October 7th, the first one, 3 years ago, when I was overwhelmed with a rage-filled grief that wouldn't subside. And bewildered by this wave, I turned toward what sustained me, my spiritual practice and tending with the ancestors. And dropping into a moment of contemplation with them, I conjured enough stillness to hear what the source of unrest was. It was that I was witnessing excessive violence against women and children in pursuit of settler colonialism. It awakened my personal relationship to that history as a descendant from Louisiana, a history that was executed on the bodies of Black enslaved women, birthing a free labor force in North America. And to be clear, this was the focus of my dissertation research, exploring the decolonial turn in maternal health care to address racial disparities. And through that sacred scholarship journey, which required that I review slave records from Louisiana, I discovered the legacy of an unseen force, an imperative that still thrives in birthing institutions today, the ghosts of an institution. I remembered then how I managed to move through that process, communion with nature and with my ancestors, who illumined all the ways in which one's spirit was and can never be broken. These insights arrived in dreams as my great-great-grandmother modeled her midwifery magic, the alchemy she pulsed through her hands that transformed tragedies into gold. I call her honeycomb hands. Among granny midwives in the United States during the 19th and 20th centuries, there was a ritual which had been carried across the big waters during the transatlantic slave trade. It was called sussing, the infusion of oils with medicinal herbs that were rubbed over the entirety of a mother's body during labor. The herbs promoted relaxation of muscles that increased blood flow, softening tissues to support her innate life-giving capacity. This practice happened in captivity. These are the radical love traditions we have inherited. They form the base of our understanding of how the medicine lives within each of us. The ritual of sussing was carried in the bodies of captured humans, a living somatic library. It's so important to remember these inheritances as we navigate the current cultural ruptures, to remind ourselves of how we alchemized tragedy and made beauty, affirm mutual dignity, embodied Ubuntu, I am because we are. How this disrupts the psychic imprint of disconnection from the rest of life or being pushed to a margin. There is medicine within the poison. It can be excavated when we're steady enough to receive it. Contemplative practices, spiritual devotion, communion with the forces of nature, all of these serve to slow the pulse just enough to entrain with a wider field of knowing and being, also known as the realm of psyche. To deepen this process of remembering and reawakening the medicines within, I want to turn a gaze toward, just briefly, some of the colonial roots of psychiatry and psychology in pursuit of liberating ourselves from that spell. What's my time? Okay? So we're going to do a little bit of the cultivating critical consciousness dive, and I'm just going to take the knowledge from the ivory tower and throw it to you. We will have time for discussion and Q&A, so if there's something I say that's like, what does that even mean? Please don't hesitate to interrupt me and ask, okay? I, like I'm sure many of you, have experienced much discontent with the fields of psychology, and mostly because the profession has a steadfast commitment to being apolitical and an unwillingness to grapple with racialization, not merely as a political project, but as a psychosomatic phenomenon. So pausing here for a brief share, this is the reason I started my organization, Decolonizing the Psyche, because in the somatic program, which soma just means the body, I was the only Black person, the only Black woman in 3 cohorts. And most of the conversations would center around yoga or some kind of alternative practice. And I love those things, they're great, it's fine. But I kept raising my hand and say, can we discuss the making of races and the body? Like, can we discuss the spell of racialization as a somatic thing that happened to us? And I got crickets. So I went on Facebook and I started a group, and whatever I couldn't share in the classroom, I shared in the Facebook group. Eventually there were 3,000 members. And over time, my ancestors pushed me to then generate the website, create the courses, and continue the work. We often hear how race is a social construct, yes, but racialization is a psychic production with material implications and impact. One way of articulating this is through the philosophy of liberation called colonial matrix of power, and it's a concept coined by a man named Annibal Keano, furthered by scholars in the global South. And the coloniality of power articulates how the last 500 years, also called modernity, has been and continues to be shaped by European global domination, achieved through establishing a human hierarchy known as races. This redefinition and distortion of identity and being is in service to capitalism and the hoarding of resources by the global North. So coloniality, it acts as an enduring, interconnected system of racial, social, economic, epistemic, or knowledge production domination that dictates who controls resources, authority, while systematically marginalizing non-Western people and their ways of knowing. That's what makes sites like these so important. So this concept, coloniality of power, articulates the psychological and philosophical terrain of our political experience. Race was invented to establish the margin, to make it. So now we have marginalized people. Positioning any people, the marginalized, at the bottom of a human hierarchy justified the extraction of their labor, their intellect, their genius, their life force, their creativity. The extraction targeted human beings and nature equally. And this project of fashioning the other is not exclusive to European people, it's just the most recent iteration of it. Oppression distorts all relationships. So this invention of races is a cultural trauma. It's not really an identity, races. It's the fashioning of that hierarchy. In the spirit of collectivism, structural naming takes the blame away from the individual to announce how what one may be suffering with is the result of structural conditions, of colonial pursuits, in the case of racialization. This is liberating. In the words of Frantz Fanon, what we are attempting to do is to liberate ourselves from the arsenal of complexes germinated in the colonial situation. So I want to move now to the liberatory frontiers a bit. So I'm going to close out this bit. The investigation of the interior of the self is a cultural practice that stretches back tens of thousands of years, despite lack of written accounts. Our earliest documented histories of this practice can be found in Egypt, Greece, Rome, among others. And prior to this, indigenous healing was an ongoing practice, one that was not dependent on scientific scrutiny or analysis, nor made relevant through empirical bodies of evidence. And many of these early documented healing techniques, as well as those undocumented, laid the foundation for 17th and 18th century psychiatry, and eventually the emergence of depth psychologies. But psychiatry has deep colonial roots historically. It emerged in the colonial era. Psychiatric formulations reflected the agenda of ethnocentrism and the agenda of colonial regimes. I want to read now from the APA, the American Psychological Association's apology for contributions to systemic racism. This is the how of their collusion with inventing races and creating the human hierarchy. So this is what they did. The APA said, we're sorry for establishing and participating in scientific models and approaches rooted in scientific racism, creating, sustaining, and promulgating ideas of human hierarchy through the construction, study, and interpretation of racial differences, promoting the idea that racial difference is biologically based and fixed, using psychological science and practice to support segregated and subpar education for people of color, creating and promoting widespread use of psychological tests and instruments that discriminated against people of color, failing to take concerted action in response to calls for an end to that testing and psychometric racism, and supporting the widespread use of educational assessments and interventions that were lucrative for the field of psychology, but harmed people of color. I hope the source of discontent is clarifying. These systems we're talking about, though, are formidable. They are sophisticated. They've been animated by the breath, thought, and actions of millions of human beings. So steady, steady. And may this sort of review imbue you with the courage, the compassion, the patience, and the pride for what you all have created and contribute to here. So there is a redemptive arc that I just want to name briefly in these closing moments. Who did it differently? The first man is Frantz Fanon, and he was from Martinique, a French colony. He was a psychiatrist who practiced in Algeria. He was also a freedom fighter in the Algerian War. And one of the things he's known for, he was known as the first ethno-psychiatrist. During the Algerian War, his time working at an asylum, he was charged with treating patients who were Algerian colonial subjects. They were basically thrown into a mental health asylum, but they were subjects, colonial subjects under French rule, which means their quality of life was not great. And so Frantz Fanon one day said, there's no way I can, in good conscience, diagnose or treat these people without looking at the context of their living conditions. And he resigned. After his resignation, He then wrote the book Black Skin, White Mask, and he was the first one to articulate the actual impact of colonization on the mental health of human beings. So he did it right. His contribution, a relational model, is called sociogeny. Sociogenetic means a phenomenon is always understood within the context that it emerges. That's it. My depression has to be understood in the context of radical displacement of my community or radical food insecurity. It can't just be seen as an individual problem. It can't be attributed to individual brokenness either, which is what Western models attempt to do. Another who did it right was Martin Barrow, a liberation psychologist from the global South, South America. And so he critiqued Eurocentric psychologies for their ahistoricism and what he called the homeostatic vision of reality. What he said was psychology tries to change the individual while preserving the social order. And that can't happen. You have to change the structure that people live within in order to sustain their psychological and psychic well-being. I want to take a moment and reflect on what Sevi and I were talking about earlier, sensing on this Juneteenth celebration and the declaration of Juneteenth as a national holiday, an unsettled ghostiness about it. It feels as if the ghosts are like, okay, you've acknowledged us, you're making it a national holiday, but what are we memorializing without substantive, institutional, and structural change? That's how we settle the ghosts. Yeah?
Can you say that one more time?
Okay. So just reflecting on what Sevi and I were talking about earlier in the context of Martin Barrow's comment on how psychology tries to change the individual while preserving the social order. So instead of understanding that it's necessary to transform the structure that people live in order to transform their sense of well-being, we focus on changing the individual in contemporary Western psychological models. And so I pause to give acknowledgement to, on this Juneteenth celebration, the feeling tone of the unsettled ghosts of that lived experience, of that historical and ancestral legacy. That what are we actually memorializing by making this a national holiday without also instituting some substantive structural change? That means reparations. That means tax breaks for descendants of the enslaved. I don't want to pay taxes to this war regime. That means all kinds of other things that people have been studying and writing and theorizing about for decades. That is the way we settle the ghosts in the legacy of Juneteenth. Because right now they're not settled. So that's what liberation psychology is. Huge critique of the limitations of Western psychology. And the final figure to mention is Malidoma Patrice Somé, adjacent field of African spirituality. He was a writer, a Dagara shamanic healer. And in the early 2000s, he began receiving clients with schizophrenia and taking them on pilgrimages to the Caribbean and his home country, Burkina Faso. And in his culture of the Dagara people, schizophrenics are not viewed pathologically. They're not demonized. Often, they're understood as mediums bringing messages to the community from the spirit world. So he worked with them in his community, giving them, those living with schizophrenic symptoms, proper nutrition, the proper spiritual support so that they can sort of navigate what was moving through them. Because without the proper tools, you don't know how to tend what's coming up. And he was quite successful. So in closing, it's through this kind of portal of reorientation as expressed through Frantz Fanon, Martin Barrow, Malidoma Patrice Somé, that we might feel into a return, a reawakening, a remembering of what actually sustains us. And I want to lift up 5 strategies to help us navigate this inner road. The first is collectivism. As much as we can, resist and undo hyper-individualism, the illusion that we're disconnected. Like, how do I embody Ubuntu from day to day? It doesn't have to be excessive, but keeping it as a principle could look something as simple as, every time I breathe out, the tree breathes in. And every time I breathe in, the tree breathes out. Okay. Some wounds are never meant to be carried alone, hence the need for collectivism. And cultural wounds are one example of that. Number 2, communion with nature sustains us. In the field of eco-psychology, we have techniques that center sun and soil to alleviate anxiety and depression. Because when your skin touches it, your nervous system resets. So there's research emerging on that. Our people have known that forever. So just lifting it up here. Number 3, spirituality. Tending one's inner world is our vocation, and it also must be a consistent personal practice. I was surprised to find that in the emergence of psychiatry and psychology, one of their main goals was to remove spirituality from it. At the 17th and 18th century, because the European experience is mired with religious trauma and warfare. They've been fighting for a long time around religiosity and fundamentalism. And so their movement toward rationality and scientific, the Enlightenment era and things like that, poised them to remove spirit. That's not something we do. So just lifting that out. Number 4, the power of the arts. It's not simply art for art's sake. Sound, music, imagery, textile, these are all spiritual technologies. Yes. Images and visual cortex activation stimulate something called mirror neurons in the body. They're also called the empathy neuron. So your capacity for empathy grows when you're engaged upon by art. Isn't that something? And 5, returning to what sustains us also looks like drawing on our older traditions to generate new systems of knowledge. So one thing I'm committed to is the practice of weaving Ifa and Orisha devotion into my therapeutic spaces. I work with the Orishas, I lift them up, I use their symbols, their metaphor, their medicines in the relaying of information or working with clients at the individual or collective level. That disrupts Western psychology's stronghold. And it's no small feat. Thank y'all for receiving what I had to offer. Yes?
My question is, what roles do ancestors play in healing, even for people who feel disconnected from their roots?
Grab the mic real quick. Say it one more time.
My question is, what role do ancestors play in healing? And even for people who feel disconnected from their ancestors.
And disconnected in the sense of you don't know who they are? Okay. So let me state a couple of important things. Just dying doesn't make you an ancestor. Okay? So crossing over doesn't make one benevolent. And so in my practice and work, it is very important that I'm supporting people to guide them toward vibrancy, vitality, wisdom, sources of care and support among their lineages. That can be done if you know where your people are from or you're adopted. And it's an embodied spiritual ritual practice that I guide people through and you would be surprised at what comes forward. So that's the first ground I want to lay, is that distinction. The second is there's an intersection between ancestral trauma and intergenerational trauma transmission. So things that don't get healed up, metabolized, integrated, and made whole among our ancestors can repeat as patterns among the descendants and the living. So cross-culturally, ancestral reverence is common to most indigenous people on the earth. You talk to the people who lived before you on earth so you can figure out how to live on earth, because earth can be challenging. You might need some perspective, right? Turning toward them with, let's say, something as simple as one of the things worked on in my lineage healing was addiction to sugar. My people loved sugar. We grew sugar. Of course we're eating sugar, right? But then it became early death, 46 years old for aunts, 50 for my mother, right? So you work to get to the root of what's driving the hunger. And when I can do that with my ancestors, it then becomes a source of wisdom and liberation for myself. I make different choices. In fact, I don't eat sugar at all. Thank you.
One other question. Thank you for answering that question. What was number 5?
Oh.
As people were taking notes. What was number 5?
Number 5 was just what we were talking about. Returning to what sustains us, drawing on older traditions to generate new systems of knowledge and meaning. So, prime example is drawing on the older tradition of ancestral healing to generate new approaches to mental well-being. So thank you, yeah.